Why isn't Vladimir Putin afraid of the West?
Let's just first be clear about how Russian corruption works. Like, the centre of Russian corruption isn't in Moscow. The centre of Russian corruption is in British tax havens, London property, Swiss banks and Austrian bank accounts and property all over the European Union. Russian corruption works like this. Huge amounts of money, billions and billions, are extracted out of the Russian budget and Russian state companies, and then they are brought to Western Europe to be secured. And over the past 10 years, Putin has watched how Western European elites, desperate for money in an era of low growth, have been willing to launder this money. And this has convinced him that Europe will do absolutely nothing to kill the oligarch golden goose that feeds it. And he's absolutely confident that Europeans will not impose banking restrictions, they'll not impose visa restrictions, and they'll certainly not do anything to close down their profitable tax havens. Putin thinks the West has changed. He thinks the West was a crusading alliance 25 years ago, but today the West has the morality of a hedge fund. Make money and move it offshore.
All right, Richard, it sounds like Ben is saying Vladimir Putin is sort of the ultimate mob boss here. Do you agree?
With some parts of what Ben just said, I would agree with. And forget whether he's the ultimate mob boss. He does certainly run the country in a sort of mob-like way, and his power base is like that. But I think the basic point that he has judged the West as unlikely to respond in ways that really hurt him is correct. And that judgment is formed over a variety of things. One aspect of it may be corruption and how the financial flows go. But he's also had a few experiences, like Georgia in the summer of 2008, which he did a miniature version of what he's now done in Crimea and got absolutely no response. So I think his basic calculation about a kind of enfeebled West in the response to this sort of action is correct.
Ben, if the West cannot respond effectively to Putin's incursion in Ukraine, what's to stop him from going further?
Putin believes that the West failed to impose any financial sanctions after the Georgian war that were meaningful because London, Paris and Berlin are desperate for cash and will always put money before values in this era of low growth. Putin is goading the West on, and we've been hearing very worrying reports out of Moscow.
Ben, goading the West with what aim, with what objective?
We've been hearing very worrying reports out of Moscow today that people who've been meeting with Kremlin insiders have been suggesting that Putin believes he's dealing with the weakest Western elite in a generation. And if no steps are taken after Crimea, he may well move on and take more territory in eastern and southern Ukraine. Putin is all about finding where the red lines are, finding where the blocks to action are. And right now, this confused response from the West, with Germany saying that it doesn't want Russia thrown out of the G8, with John Kerry saying America might want it thrown out of the G8, and Britain talking about the need for diplomacy. There are definitely no red lines in sight for Vladimir Putin.
Then, Richard, put simply, is this Putin's way to simply have a chance of getting a territory back that Khrushchev gave away years ago and shouldn't have?
I don't think so. I think he's worried about a number of other things than just taking over the territory. He's worried in part about what was the direction that Ukraine would grow. Ukraine is a really important country for Russia, and it was heading closer and closer to integration with the European Union and eventually NATO membership. And what does NATO membership mean? It means F-16s right up on your border. I mean, he's already got them in Lithuania and Estonia. Literally NATO fighter jets operating essentially in Russian airspace. And I think as he looked at it, he said, I cannot accept this. I just cannot let these things go that far.
So you think he's
hoping
doing the right
that
thing?
The Ukrainians will do what? The Ukrainians will say, okay, in exchange for some kind of a non-aggression agreement with the Russians, we will agree to some kind of Swiss-like neutrality?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think this is really a masterstroke on the part of Vladimir Putin. I mean, the loss of Yanukovych, who he, by all accounts, detested but propped up nonetheless, was a major diplomatic and political loss for Vladimir Putin. I mean, the events that occurred in the streets of Kiev did not go his way. And so he had a bad couple weeks there, I mean, during the Olympics, and this is how he's responded. Whether it's an irrational response or not, well, time will tell. But I think Ben is actually correct, and so is Vladimir Putin. The West has very little leverage and is not strong here. I mean, if Vladimir Putin really wants to use his power in an old 19th century sort of way, there's no one ready to stop him.
Ben, you want to weigh in?
Well, It's important to remember that Vladimir Putin is not just a 19th century empire builder, he's also a 21st century cynic. And that Putin over the last few years has been seeing protests against his rule, a lot of questioning of what is this rule for. And one of the new propaganda campaigns that he's been launching in Russia is to justify his continuing grip over Russia and thus his continuing corruption with the story of empire. And for Putin, he hopes for a huge popularity boost in the country from nationalists if he can restore Crimea to Russia. So this is about popularity at home as much as seizing territory abroad.
Is it ultimately? I mean, we saw protests in Russia over the past couple of years. They sort of flare up and then they go away when, somebody flexes his muscles in Moscow or St. Petersburg, Richard. But to what degree is Vladimir Putin really afraid of anything right now?
I mean, Ben has a different perspective on it than I do. I mean, it looks to me like his grip on power is pretty secure.
Yeah.
And that's not foremost in his worries. Now, I do think there is something to this corruption point. I mean, the oligarchs and Putin personally have enriched themselves immensely since the collapse of the Soviet Union in all sorts of non-transparent ways. And the European economies have assisted in that and provide some of the lifestyle benefits. So there is something to that. The elite in Russia really have gotten very, very rich over the last 20 years in ways that are ostentatious beyond belief. And I think a desire to perpetuate that is a factor.
So, Ben, if you factor in how rich they have become, how powerful Vladimir Putin is, and right now how he's not afraid of the West, does this make him more powerful than ever?
Putin's great danger is that the Russian budget only balances with the oil price at over $110 a barrel. And more than 50% of Russians live directly from the budget. They're civil servants, they're teachers, they're pensioners, they're on benefits. And if the oil price collapsed, or if the ruble collapsed, Putin would see his budget explode and would be unable to pay for all these different sectors of society that he's bribed to support him. So Putin has a lot of economic threats down the road. There's been a lot of nerves in Moscow today about how far will Putin go, and has Putin miscalculated? What happens if body bags of Russian troops start coming back from the front in Donetsk or Odessa? What happens if the West does have the courage to impose visa bans and banking restrictions on big Russian oligarchs and corporations? Will these people decide that Putin's become a threat to their long-term prosperity? So some Russian liberals and Russian Democrats hope that the West will move in that direction in order for Putin's rule to be threatened.